My name is Jonathan Pierce. I've seen a lot in my career, but some calls make the blood run colder before you even arrive. The one from the Port Authority came in just after midnight. A body had been found on Pier 7, abandoned, brutal, and left in a way that spoke more about the killer than the victim. I drove through the foggy streets of the waterfront. The scent of salt and oil hit me before the pier came into view. Ships loomed like silent giants in the mist, their hulls reflecting the scattered lights along the docks. Seagulls cried in the distance, echoing off the warehouses. Pier 7 was almost deserted. A few security lights blinked on steel poles, casting harsh shadows over stacked crates and tangled nets. The faint sound of water slapping against the hulls of docked vessels filled the silence. I stepped onto the pier. The body was there, half hidden between two shipping containers. A man. Mid-30s, work clothes soaked in blood. He had been beaten, stabbed, left with a single, deep cut across his throat, precise, deliberate. No witnesses. No signs of a struggle beyond the immediate area. I crouched to examine the scene. Footprints in the wet wooden planks led toward the edge of the pier. 2 sets. One belonged to the victim. The other, larger, heavier, and careful, avoiding loose boards as if the killer had planned every step. The victim's hands were clenched. I noticed a scrap of paper in one. A receipt from a nearby warehouse, time-stamped 2 hours before the body was discovered. Nothing else. No wallet. No phone. I walked along the pier, flashlight in hand. The shadows danced across crates and ropes, creating shapes that felt alive. Somewhere above, a seagull landed, startled, wings snapping in the fog. The killer had left little behind. No fingerprints, no DNA, nothing that could immediately point to a suspect. But something about the placement of the body, the angle, the way the victim's head was tilted, it felt staged. I moved to the end of the pier. The water reflected the dim lights like broken glass. The tide was high, waves rocking the mooring lines. I imagined the killer stepping back, watching, maybe even taking the same care I had seen in the footprints. I pulled out my notebook. Every detail mattered: the crate positions, the footprints, the angle of the wound, the time the victim was last seen alive. Then I noticed it, a shadow among the stacked containers. Not moving, not hiding, just waiting. I tightened my grip on the flashlight. I was alone, but not for long. The docks, silent and cold, had a way of speaking to you in whispers only a detective could hear. And tonight they were screaming. The fog hung heavier as I moved along the pier. Every step on the damp wood echoed like a gunshot, bouncing between the hulks of docked vessels and stacked containers. The salt water smell was strong, mingled with the coppery tang of blood that lingered around the body. I took notes carefully, sketching the positions of crates, ropes, and footprints. The larger set of footprints was still clear in the soft mud near the edge of the pier. The killer had moved deliberately, keeping to shadows and avoiding loose planks. Someone who knew the pier well. I started with the warehouses. Most were locked at this hour, but a few night workers were still around, unloading cargo under weak floodlights. I introduced myself quickly, Jonathan Pierce, city detective, and asked if anyone had seen anything unusual. Most shook their heads. One older man hesitated, then whispered, I saw a guy near Pier 7 a few hours ago. Tall, in dark clothes. Didn't stop. Just walked past like he owned the place. Nothing specific. No face, no name. But it was a start. I moved to the security shack, hoping the cameras would have caught something. The monitors were old and grainy, but one camera covered the section where the body was found. I rewound footage, every frame a blur of fog, crane lights, and shadows moving between containers. Then I saw it, a figure in dark clothes, moving slowly, carefully, like a predator. They placed the body with precision, adjusted its posture, then vanished back into the mist. No one else. No vehicles. Nothing to explain how they had gotten in and out so quickly. I scribbled notes furiously. This was not a random attack. It was planned, executed by someone methodical and familiar with the port. I walked back to Pier 7. The tide had risen slightly, covering some of the footprints along the edge. I paused, shining my flashlight into the dark water. Nothing. But I found another clue. Near the edge of a container, I spotted a small piece of fabric caught on a nail. Blue, slightly frayed, probably from a jacket. I bagged it carefully. As I turned to leave, I felt it again, the weight of the empty pier, the silence that pressed down around me. I wasn't alone. The docks had a way of keeping secrets, and tonight, I could feel that someone, or something, was still watching, just beyond the reach of my light. I drove back toward headquarters, replaying the footage in my mind. The killer knew exactly how to move unseen. Every step, every placement of the body, every vanished trace, deliberate. The case was just beginning. And I had a feeling the docks had a few more surprises waiting for me. I returned to the docks the next morning. Fog had lifted, leaving a gray light that made the pier seem older, colder, and somehow more hostile than it had at night. Workers were starting their shifts, trucks rolling in and out, cranes moving containers with slow, deliberate motions. I walked along the pier again, retracing the killer's steps. The mud had hardened, preserving faint impressions of footprints near the edge. I photographed everything, catalogued the positions, and checked the surrounding area for anything I might have missed. The piece of fabric I found last night was sent for analysis. Nothing unusual yet, but it could be matched to clothing from workers on site. It wasn't much, but in a case this cleanly executed, small clues mattered. I talked to a few dockhands during their breaks. Most were hesitant, suspicious, or too tired to notice anything. One young man, barely more than a boy, mentioned seeing someone new around Pier 7 the past week. Tall, built, always quiet, often near the containers where shipments from overseas were unloaded. I noted it. The description matched the figure on the security footage, the shadow in the fog. I asked for names, but he shrugged. No one knew who he was. I moved to the nearby warehouses. A few supervisors reluctantly gave access to their logs. I scanned shipping manifests, worker rosters, and delivery schedules. Nothing unusual appeared at first glance. But a pattern emerged. The missing man had been handling shipments from a single company, a small importer whose trucks were rarely checked thoroughly. I made my way to the office of the shipping company. The clerk was nervous when I asked about the victim, stammering over delivery details. One entry caught my eye, a cargo crate marked "Priority," scheduled for loading the night the body appeared. No one seemed to know who signed it off. Back on Pier 7, I inspected the containers again. The crate in question was still there, its seal broken, empty. No signs of struggle inside, just the faint smell of fish oil and salt. The tide was creeping in. I photographed the edges, noting how close the body had been to falling in. The killer had staged it carefully, far enough from the water to leave prints, close enough to create a chilling scene. As I was about to leave, I noticed a small detail I had missed, a bolt sticking out of the dock near the edge. The blue fabric had caught on it. Someone had returned here after leaving the body, deliberately placing it back in my path. I paused. The killer wasn't finished. They were aware I was investigating. And that meant one thing: the next move would be theirs. The air smelled of salt and diesel as I returned to the pier that evening. Fog rolled in off the water, curling around stacked containers and steel beams, giving the whole place a spectral, abandoned feel, even though trucks and workers were still moving around, unaware of what had happened. I started with the shipping manifests again. The priority crate was key. Its path through the docks had been logged, but only partially. Someone had altered records, leaving gaps that weren't obvious at first glance. I circled the pier mentally, mapping every person, every camera angle, every shipment. Then I noticed the workers. Not all of them. One man lingered near the far end of the pier, away from cranes and forklifts. Tall, broad-shouldered, watching the water. He didn't wave, didn't move much. Just stood there. I walked closer. Footsteps on the wooden planks echoed. The man turned slightly, but not fully, just enough to see his outline. I froze, pretending to check my notebook. He left without a sound. No truck, no vehicle, no trace, just disappeared among the containers. I climbed the pier ladders, inspecting the rooftops of some stacked crates. From above, I could see gaps in surveillance coverage, shadows moving where the cameras wouldn't catch them. Someone had known exactly how to use the space to remain unseen. Back at ground level, I examined the crate again. Inside was a clipboard. Handwriting on the pages was neat, organized, but the notes made little sense at first. Delivery times, initials, and cryptic numbers. It wasn't random. Someone wanted it to look like that. I traced the initials in the dock registry. One worker matched them, a temp, new to the port, no references. He had been assigned to Pier 7 the same night the victim was killed. I felt the fog press in closer, my flashlight beam cutting weak lines through it. Every shadow seemed to stretch, every crane arm loomed higher, sharper. The pier wasn't haunted. But it had rules. And the killer knew them all. I jotted down everything: the crate, the temp, the altered records, the mysterious man watching from afar. It was a web, small and precise. But it was enough to follow. I knew I was close. The killer was careful, methodical, but no one can erase all traces. And in a place as exposed and structured as the docks, the truth always leaves a mark. As I drove back to headquarters, the fog began rolling over the water in thick sheets. I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. Every creak of a crane, every slap of water against the pier sounded like a warning. This was no ghost story. This was real. And whoever had done this was still out there, planning their next move. The next morning, I returned to Pier 7 with a plan. The fog was lighter, but the chill cut through my coat. The docks were waking up, cranes groaning and metal clanging as workers began their shifts. I needed to move quickly. The killer wouldn't stay hidden forever. I reviewed the notes and photographs I'd taken. The priority crate. The frayed piece of blue fabric. The temp worker's initials. The man who had been watching from afar. It was a pattern, predictable, methodical, and crucially traceable. I started by checking the temp's schedule. He had been assigned to Pier 7 overnight. No one had seen him leave, and he had no alibi. I also discovered that he had handled the priority crate just hours before the murder. I asked the port authority to pull all logs and camera footage from the past week. Grainy images confirmed my suspicions. The temp had been moving through restricted areas, sometimes alone, sometimes meeting a taller, broader man in shadows between containers. I went back to the pier with a uniformed officer, keeping my distance. We waited near the container stacks, watching entrances and exits. Hours passed. Then I saw him, the tall man, broad-shouldered, moving carefully through the fog. He paused at the crate, checking the surrounding area. I signaled to the officer, and we approached slowly. He spun when he heard our steps, and in that split second, I saw the tension in his eyes, the calculated, practiced calm of someone who thought they'd gone unnoticed. I called out, "Police! Step away from the crate." He hesitated, then bolted toward the water. I chased him along the pier. Boards creaked beneath his weight, metal chains rattled, and the wind off the harbor whipped around us. The taller man had the advantage. He knew the layout, the hiding spots, every beam and container. But I had the evidence, the plan, and the support of the officer. Cornering him near the far end of the pier, I drew my gun and shouted again. He froze, realizing escape was impossible. We cuffed him without further incident. Back at headquarters, I reviewed the interrogation. The man and the temp had conspired together, covering their tracks with careful attention to schedules, shadows, and false paperwork. The victim had stumbled onto something, a shipment irregularity, an argument, and paid the price. The case was closed. No ghosts, no shadows beyond the obvious. Just human calculation and human violence. Yet, as I left the docks that evening, the fog rolling in over Pier 7 once again, I couldn't shake the feeling that the place had a way of holding on to memories. The creak of a crane, the slap of water against wood, the echo of footsteps, reminders that even the most methodical crime leaves a mark. I walked away, noting every detail in my mind, knowing that the docks would always have stories to tell. And in my line of work, that was enough to keep you awake at night.